So welcome to the second lecture in the Sinophone Classicism lecture series by the famous poet Yang Lian. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Lutz-Bachmann to send us a word of greeting via Zoom. Hey, Lutz-Bachmann.
Hello, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I welcome you as the director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften for the second lecture in the series Sinophone Classicism. I thank Professor Yang very warm that you are as a head and organizer behind the whole series. And I personally would like to welcome young Lian, our speaker this afternoon. Thank you very much for being with us and attending this lecture. Thank you, Professor Yang.
So without further ado, dear colleagues, students, friends, and in the room as well as online, it is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Yang Lian, who needs no introduction to anyone who has been following Chinese literature in the last 4 decades. Born in 1955 in Bern, Switzerland, to 2 Chinese diplomats, Yang Lian grew up in Beijing and was an active member in the underground poetry scene in the immediate aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. Discontent with the mainstream socialist realist literature at that time, he and his fellow like-minded young poets learned from Western modernist literature, taboo in the Maoist era. Their group of avant-gardists came to be known as misty poets for their purported obscurity, at least in the eyes of their critics. Ironically, over time, it has become the only poetry worth mentioning from 1980s and 90s China for readers and researchers alike. I remember reading Yang Lian and his fellow misty poets for the first time when I was in middle school, having found them on my father's bookshelf. He doesn't know that. By the mid-1990s, they had been solidly canonized in mainland China. Little did I, a small-town teenager, know that many of the poets whom I was reading at the time were already living overseas as exiles following the event of 1989. In hindsight, however, this traumatic political event has introduced poets like Yang Lian, Bei Dao, and Gu Cheng to the international literary scene. Yang Lian has been living as a poet émigré in Sydney, London, and now Berlin. His poetry is instantly translated into foreign languages. He has won numerous international poetry prizes and decorations and has been a board member of PEN International since 2007. He was a fellow at Forschungskolleg zu Berlin from 2012 to 2013, where I met him for the first time when I became fellow in the unfortunate year of the plague. To me, among his generation of poets, Yang Lian's poetry is the most fascinating, as it has always sought to combine a highly innovative and experimentative poetics, what we recognize as the language of world literature today, with expressions and aesthetics harking back to classical Chinese poetry. A powerful image that he creates to capture this kind of poetry is a tower built downward into the roots of the Chinese indigenous lyrical and prosodic traditions. Without further ado, I hereby welcome Yang Lian to share with us his thoughts on an ongoing dialogue between modern and classical poetic traditions.
Thank you very much, anyway. Very nice introduction. It's okay? Well, again, I don't think I'm here trying to do academic lecture. I just want to share some experience of writing as a poet, maybe as a person. And but again, I think this topic here to me is extremely interesting because everybody knows there are thousands of years of the history of Chinese poetry writing. But to me, the most important thing is how to bring the personal, the individual energies into this long history. We thought this independent, individual creative energies, and we probably cannot call that we have a tradition. All we have, it was only a past. So let me start from one poem. And shall we project the poem 1989? Thank you. And the poem we were going to read, it will be, yes, the title 1989. It was written at the end of 1989, that year, and the Tiananmen massacre happened in June in Beijing. And start from that time, my wife and I becoming, let's say, Chinese writers in exile. Well, we need a poem. There we go. Okay. Okay, we're done. Oh, sorry, too much. Yeah, well, it's not so clear, but I mark some words in rather darker colors. And well, I hope you pay a little attention, especially if you know Chinese, and you will see how that the invisible link between those words, and then we can talk about them. Firstly, I want to read this poem for you. And thank our dear Zhiyi will read the English translation for me. 1989年，谁说死者会互相拥抱，像一匹匹马，鬃毛银灰，站在窗外结冰的月光中。死者埋进过去的日子，刚刚过去，疯子就被绑在床上，僵直如铁钉，钉着黑暗的木头。棺盖每天就这样合拢。谁说死者已死去？死者关在末日里流浪，是永久的主人。4堵墙上有4张自己的脸，再屠杀一次，血仍是唯一著名的风景。睡进坟墓有福了，却又醒在一个鸟儿更怕的明天。这无非是普普通通的一年。
I read the English translation by Brian Houghton. 1989. Who says the dead can embrace? Like the horses, manes silver gray, standing outside the window in the freezing moonlight. The dead are buried in the days of the past. In days not long past, madmen were tied onto beds, rigid as iron nails, pinning down the timbers of darkness. The coffin lid each day, closing over like this. Who says the dead are dead and gone? The dead, enclosed in the vagrancy of their final days, are the masters of forever. 4 faces of their own on 4 walls. Butchery yet again. Blood is still the only famous landscape. Slept into the tomb, they were lucky, but they wake up again. In a tomorrow, the birds fare even more. This is no doubt a perfectly ordinary year.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe you can follow those words. For example, like death, like the bed, like the iron nail, like the timbers of darkness, like coffin lid, like includes in the vagrancy of their final days, like the four walls, like slipping into, like they wake again, tomorrow, an ordinary year. They are words, but not only words. They are images. And they are not only images, they are the systems of images. To me, and they are bring our thought layers and layers deeper until the last sentence. This is no doubt a perfectly ordinary year. And all my friends that time was totally shocked and surprised. And how could you think 1989 is an ordinary year, which is our life changed totally? But I think poetry is question deeper. And if we feel so surprising and crying for the Tiananmen massacre, as the very first time we saw this kind of a killing, where is the memory of all the death and death happened before? And if our tears actually washing this memory away again, and how could we guarantee our crying now is not prepared for the next killing and surprising? So to me, the Tiananmen is not only an happening, it is a situation. And we are always there. After 1989, we saw 9/11, we saw Iraqi wars, we saw the refugee waves, we saw the so-called globalization, but bring the power and the commercial money together. We saw the spiritual crisis of the Western democracy. We saw the universal selfish and cynicism. We saw the backwards of Hong Kong. We saw the splitting of COVID-19. We are in a situation of death. Every year is an ordinary year. I think poetry, through the images, deliver the energy of thought. After the, okay, let's put here first. The Chinese characters, the energy of the images, now back. After 1989, I becoming a poet in exile. And I traveled through so many countries in the world. But actually, I traveled within one classical Chinese poem, which is the poem in Chinese title, Deng Gao, an English translation, from high above, translated by Brian Houghton, is my own translator, but my principal translator, let's say that. And yes, I travel within this classical poems. And now, with this poem, I would like to read it for you. The poem was written in Tang Dynasty more than 1,200 years ago, but it's also written now. Deng Gao, 风急天高猿啸哀，渚清沙薄鸟飞怀。无边落木萧萧下，不尽长江滚滚来。万里悲秋常作客，百年多病独登台。艰难苦恨繁霜鬓，潦倒新停浊酒杯。Zhiyi, please.
A grumbling gale, sky high above, apes howl and moan. Fresh river islands, white sands, birds flying home to roost. No end of failing trees, leaves fall in the whistling wind. Never still, the great river, rolling and rippling on. 1,000 miles of heart-sore autumns, and here I am, always a stranger. A long life of sickness, climbing the tower alone. Worries and cares and bitter regrets and a whole frost at my temples. A worn-out old vagrant. Miserable, now I've given up the drink.
To me, this poem is actually the principal poem, not only for Chinese poets, not only for me, but for all poets who experienced exile, or even for everybody, because everybody is in exile today. But with this, because the exile to me is like a grammar. It's connecting up the fate of all poets throughout the ages. Exile breaks through the walls of time, discover the same blood link hide inside of Chinese characters. I'm give you this one shows first, like this is the first and second line of this poem from high above. Well, in the classical Chinese way, this the pair of sentence is called antithesis. That means antithesis, which is these two sentences are mirror each other, echo each other visually. Actually, the noun to noun, the verb to verb, adjective to adjective, and like the two actually lines build up one space. But if you look carefully for the two sentences, and back to a little bit, see the translation of that. Even Brian Houghton didn't manage to keep these characters really exactly mirror each other, but the basic feeling he tried to put there. And the first two lines, are there real sentence or actually three images in each line and 6 images in the 2 lines, and breaking the so-called grammars and building up a one poetical space and bring the external the views and internal feelings together and express this deeply sorrow in the poet's heart. And that is the power of images. And I think the Chinese characters give this chance to show that energy of poetry. Images, look, maybe you already saw the translation. Concrete, solid, very rich. Ezra Pound discovered that and gave the name imagism. And the in the creative combination of images, our contemporary Chinese poets building up the living system inside of each poem and to grow up a poetic space. Imagism actually made the Chinese poetry, and especially contemporary Chinese poetry, full of energies. And it's also becoming an inspiration of the modern poetry in the world. If you follow what T.S. Eliot and his generation, how they were inspired, they learned from Pan about the images. And actually, after Cultural Revolution in 1978 and 79, Zhiyi just mentioned that our group, even not a generation, our group of poets, and have been called misty poets. And why it was misty? Because we actually start our poetry writing when we were in exactly the ruins of language. There was nothing but Papakanda languages. And there was the full of those translated important words, but they are so big, but they don't have feeling and they cannot really thinking. So within our group, let's say less than 10 poets, we didn't know each other, but we did one thing in common: to throw all these big, hollow political words out of our poems, like socialism, capitalism, proletarian, materialism, even class, even struggle, even movement. But Chinese who do not know movement, even people. And there were some extreme cases like people. But what we used is back to rather traditional language: the sun, moon, night, light, earth, river, life, death, flower, love, happy, sad, da 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 da. But through the creative way of using those words or images to express our inner feeling. After all, I call that to express our own feeling with or in our own language. It was the first small theory of our poetry. Okay. Well, Zhiyi wants me to show you this extreme case of people, because there's two characters. You can see 人, which is separately meaning human person, and 民, civil or unofficial. These two characters originally meaning in Chinese, but then when they put together, becoming 人民. And but I must tell you, this word of 人民, people, was invented by not Chinese but Japanese. And the Japanese borrowed the Chinese character and put them together and invented one word, 人民, in order to translate the concept of people. But problem is, when they import back to China again, and this 人, human rights, human being, human heart is general, everybody. But 民 traditionally is in China is the unofficial, the lower level of the society, in order to be different from the officials, the leaders, like that. So the problem today is how the two characters actually quite contradiction. And when we talk about people, are you talking about human being, everybody, or you're talking about a layer of society. And if the two both are possible and even correct, and who will decide and which meaning I've been using in what time? And this is actually a big problem for the let's say modern thought in China. Well, we cannot move on too much about actually there are more than 40% of words in our mouths now in daily speech. It's this kind of second imported from Western into Japanese, from Japanese into Chinese. I think that is one of the reasons why the contemporary Chinese thinking is so shaky, is so unstable. This foundation, there is some problem, but continually, in the 2013, when I was the fellow in Forschungskolleg to Berlin, Rector Luca at that time questioned me, what is poetry? Give me a meaning. Don't give me a metaphor. It was quite a challenge. And next day, I gave a meaning to him. Well, this one a little bit different from what it was in my mind, but it was revised by somebody. Anyway, poetry, a literary form based on the musical nature of a language to express the multi-world, well, in mine was much easier. It's the multi-layers of living experience. But most important, this musical natures. I think one of the biggest misunderstanding to the modern poetry is it has no form. But oppositely, my requirements for the contemporary Chinese poetry is continually create, even invent forms. The classical Chinese poetry is still our inspiration. Back to Du Fu again. This is the third and fourth sentence off from the high above. And well, basically, these two, again, the antithesis, the meaning is the borderless falling leaves, xiao xiao dang, come down. I give you the translation, I think. Yeah, if you look the third and the fourth sentence, and borderless dried leaves, and then if you look the mark of the tones, xiao xiao xia, and the second sentence is endless Yangtze River, let's say roughly translating, but gun, right? And xiao xiao, this sound of dry leaves, followed with one character xia, the fourth tone, together with the meaning of fallen. And then the second line of this endless Yangtze River, gun, the third tones, shows the images of the weaves, followed by the character like coming. The second tone from low to higher, from far to near, and feeling like the weaves come closing and even overtake our head. And Du Fu push the Chinese tonal patterns to the extreme, and actually painting a wonderful auditorial painting in our ear, but also in our mind. Fortunately or not, the contemporary Chinese poetry or modern Chinese poetry, now we don't have a football ground, a common football ground to play the football like the classical form or poets written in the same form. But does not means that modern poetry has no form. No, every poem is a new football game. We have to set the rules for the poem, especially. We have to play very well. We have to go. So that is what the demanding of the contemporary Chinese poetry today. Okay, I'm going to read one poem for you, and this is called Mother's Handwriting. And if you if you're listening carefully, and you can hear the rhyme, especially designed rhyme like A B A B C B C D C D E D, all the way come back to A. Okay, this poem I'm going to read from this book. It's my autobiographical long poem called the Narrative Poems. And the first chapter of this book, it was based on my photo album from my first day was born and one day before my mother died. And in the whole, every page under the photos, my mother wrote beautiful words at first day and 10th day or something like that. But then my mother died in heart attack in the 7th of January, 1976. And her sudden death and left this emptiness in my heart and mind. And actually that was made me feel what I wrote down. Suddenly the meaning was changed, the weight was changed. After all, I feel like my mother actually also gave the birth, not only to my body, but also to my poetry. And after she died, after her death, actually all my poems, like the letters I sent to her, sent back to her. Okay, here is a poem. 母亲的手记。他的手抚摸，死后还抚摸。深海里一只只白珊瑚，被层层动荡的蓝折射，冷如精选的字，写给儿子写第一封家书，亲笔的，声声耳语中，海水冲刷，海流翻越一张小脸的插图。跟随笔画，一页页长大。一滴血被称为爱，从开端起就忍熟每天粘稠一点的语法。儿子的回信只能逆着时间投递，儿子的目光修改阅读的方向，读到一场病抖着捧不住一个字。他的手断了。他的海悬在纸上，隔开1寸远，墨迹的蓝更耀眼，体温凝进这个没有风能翻动的地方。珊瑚灯趁着血丝编织的傍晚，淡淡照出一首诗分娩的时刻，当所有语言响应一句梗在心里的遗言。
Mother's Handwriting, translated by Brian Houghton. Her hand gently strokes, after death still stroking, each white deep-sea coral branch refracted through layer on layer of blue roiling. cold as carefully chosen words, the first letter written to her son. In her own hand, the sea water scours with its murmuring. Through images of a little face, currents are glancing. With her scribbles, page by page growing, a drop of blood called love from the start, each day into stickier grammar ripening. Only against the tide of time can the son's reply be delivered. The son's gaze changes the direction of reading, reads up to an illness when he can't hold a word for shivering. Her cut-off hands above the page, her ocean hanging, a single inch away, the blue ink still more dazzling. Body heat curdles into a place the wind can't blow down. Chorale lamp says of a twilight, blood-plated, faintly lighting the moment of a poem in childbirth, as all language responds to dying words in a heart obstructed.
I must say, this design of the form is not only a kind of a decoration or the cheap games, it's really deeply linked with the mind, the thinking of the, which we wanted to express in the poem. And this ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EFE, FAF, the form of RAM actually is represent the form of memories. They are back and forth, endlessly deepen the understanding of now, or life. And our poetry even in the sentence of poetry sentence, I also force myself to carve the language as the music, to carve the music as the secret energy of the poem, because the Chinese language, the music or the sound is different from the Western language. For example, like my name, when you see Yang Lian, Y-A-N-G-L-I-A-N, you can simply pronounce out. But when you see the two characters, well, if you are European, probably impossible. I have to say that. But this is not only on the names; it's everywhere. For example, when I wrote a poem, I have to sync the tone, the so-called the tonal, the patterns. But I call that secret energy. For example, this line within my poem, "A Swan in Zurich," and is the Chinese read like "无止之美，美在死死握紧茫然." English translation, Zhiyi, if I made mistake. Okay, the beauty of fingers lies in holding tightly onto obscurity, but 无止之美，美在死死握紧茫然. Inside of this sentence, you can see 无止之美，美在死死握紧茫然. That is the secret movement, but energy inside of a language. It's just one example of how in the sentence we also need to to stand on the taste of classical poets. Well, I call the Chinese poetics simply the poetics of space. And Zhiyi correctly says, better to say the spatial poetics. Spatial, yeah? Is that right to pronounce that?
trying to recreate the parallelism between 空间诗选的思想之诗, therefore I changed the translation. It's not to say there's any problem with the original translation.
My speaking is rather Younglish, so don't. Yeah, there are quite many. There's a problem of the pronunciation, but the whatever the special poetics or the poetics of space actually saying one thing. I think this architecture of Chinese poetry is based on the very nature of the Chinese characters. And one of the important things, maybe if you paid attention about what Du Fu's poem, you will see that the narration in Chinese actually very often we can free from the subject, the person. And Du Fu, that poem, there were no I, you, she, we, the person, simply no. And the Chinese verbs has no tense. And so the poem Du Fu wrote more than 1,000 years ago. And when I read it, it was simply now. And so, but these two most important elements or the nature, I think is so necessary to the idea of the poetics of space. In 1993, I call that time is the darkest time of my exile, because the way to return China seems hopeless, but floating life in the West seems endless. And not only the problem how to live is much more challenging, how to write, how to continually create but not repeat ourselves. I was in Sydney that time, and I was outside of the city, sit on the cliff and face to the South Pacific Ocean and listening this big waves hit below my feet. But suddenly, one sentence, one title, where the sea stands still, and together with the structure of a sequence jump into my mind. And 4 layers of where the sea stands still, and one deepened the other, and joined together and developed a process of poem. Here, probably it's not so big enough for you to see clearly, but where I put the ending of the 4 sections of where the sea stands still here. As you can see that the first section, whole section is a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But then the first section ends up with the sentence in Chinese, 而盯着镜头的眼睛是一只仙牡蛎，正无尽地返回隔夜坏死之处。至于麻烦您，这样。
And the English translation for the last line is where the necrosis of last night goes endlessly back.
And then the ending of the second section in Chinese is 挖掘被害那无底的海底，停止在一场暴风雨不可能停止之处。
Where a storm can never stand.
Third, 大海锋利的把你毁灭成现在的你，在镜子虚构的结局蔓延无边之处。
Where the mirror's fictive ending stretches endlessly away.
Fourth and last, 用早已死亡的光切过孩子们，停止，这是从岸边眺望自己出海之处。
This shore is where we see ourselves set sail.
Well, my friends, when in Sydney, and when they asked me what you are writing, I said, oh, I'm writing a poem called Where the Sea Stands Still. No, impossible. The sea never stands still. I said, that's why I will create the place where the sea stands still. And these 4 layers actually made for me, not only a structure of poetry, but actually a structure of life. The last sentence, this shore, is where we see ourselves sit sail. And just imagine that a man standing on the cliff and watching her or himself on a boat sit sail. All external wanderings actually are part of our internal journey. And that is the formula or understanding actually made me understand why I'm here and how to continue. And when this sentence of all come out, and I already know, okay, I can continue to live and I can continue to write, because all I need is to continue my inner journey. And I thought also, to watching ourselves sit sail, isn't that also a way of creative transformation of our tradition? And so to our reincarnation is downward, is inward, is always discover or rediscover the classics. It's always discover and build the foundation of our tower. Actually, it's always create the root of ourselves. I think that is the all these histories is inside storage into one person's inner depth. Yeah. So after all, I wanted to come back to this thinking poetry, a tower built downward. To me, there are not only one, but at least 2 traditions within the classical Chinese poetry. And one is the tradition of lyrics. The other one is the tradition of thinking poetry. Really countless of classical Chinese lyric poets, we as one and only real poet thinker. His name, Zhiyi Yang. Actually, that was the very first name of almost 3,000 years of history of Chinese poetry, the first name. His long poem, 天问, Question to the Heaven, is more than 170 questions. Question from the beginning of universe, like said beginning of universe. But who said that? Thinking about the Bible, please. Yeah. And before the upper part and lower part of the world separated, how could you prove it? That's the first 2 questions. But all the way questions, one layer deepened by the other layer, and no answer. I think that gives a forever image of poet universally, the questioner. And his long poem, Li So, is run through the reality, history, mythology, back to the reality, and into the self, end up at the poetry, and a synchronic space which with multi layers express the deepest melancholy of all history. Zhi Yang, alongside Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Goethe, has no shame. Well, unfortunately, Zhi Yang drowned himself and died in exile. He also donned the fate of poets and the fate of poetry. But we have no choice, but must continually to be the questioners and to continue this tradition of thinking poetry. Well, the next poem we're going to read for you is a poem I wrote for Ai Weiwei. And this poem, the poem is titled, sorry. Oh, okay. This poem titled A Sunflower Seeds, Lines of Negation. Maybe you know that Ai Weiwei has one installation called the Sunflower Seeds. And it was more than 100 tons of sunflower seeds, but made all porcelain. And everyone was hand painted. And when I was in the opening of this installation in Tate Modern, about 10 years ago or something, and the people would question, what is the symbolic meaning of those sunflower seeds? And I said, yes. But then maybe you know that Ai Weiwei was taken to prison after when he went to check the earthquake happened in Sichuan, and more than 5,000 kids was killed by the collapsed school buildings. And then I said, he is one of the sunflower seeds. So I wrote this poem during when he was in jail. And the whole poem, every sentence in the form of negation. I hope you can recognize, but Zhiyi will read it in English. 一粒葵花籽的否定句，致艾未未。不能想象，这瓷质的江水中，曾泊着杜甫的扁舟。我不认识月光，只看见诗句的皎洁在一行行衰减，至无人，至象征，谈论一切又回避一切。我不是象征，死在一粒葵花籽硬壳下的太阳，也不是孩子们雪白坍塌的肉，并没有消失。一条破晓的地平线，不可能忘了那阵疼。骨头被玻璃切开时，像玻璃来不及叫喊，才不得不在每天的曙光中叫喊。一场地震不会停止，一种窒息不在死后。种植到天边的栅栏，靠着更难堪的沉默。因此，我不怕年轻女警察审视我的裸体，她被烧制成型，和你的并无区别。不知道别的罪，除了10000次加深自己的罪，不落进泥土，只落进流不动的江水中。不在乎石头含着的金黄。得继续含着，像滴杜甫的老泪，不让这首诗沉沦为冷漠死寂的美。
Sorry. A sunflower sees lines of negation for Ai Weiwei. Unimaginable that Du Fu's little boat was once moored on the ceramic river. I don't know the moonlight, see only the poem's clarity, attenuated line by line to a non-person, to the symbols, discussing and avoiding everything. I'm no symbol, a sun dying under the sunflower seed's hard shell. Nor is the sun Snow White collapsed knit of children. Nor have I disappeared. Daybreak's horizon impossibly forgot that pain. Bones like glass sliced by glass. I didn't scream, so must scream at each first light. An earthquake never stands still. No need to suffocate the dead, planting rows of fences to the ends of the earth. Handcuffing ever more shameful silence, so I don't fear. The young policewoman interrogating my naked body. It was formed by fire, no different to yours. Knowing no other way to shatter but 100 millions shattering within myself, falling into no soil, only into the river that can't flow, that cares nothing for the yellow flower within the stone, having to go on, to hold back like a drop of Dufu's old tears, refusing to let the poem sink into dead, indifferent beauty.
Well, the last sentence is not only for Ai Weiwei, I think it's for all poets and everybody, refusing to let the poem sink into that indifferent beauty. After all, I think we are all in the form of negation. The contemporary Chinese poetry is the Chinese poetry written in the global context of globalization. But which kind of globalization is it? We can see that how the power and the commercial money and have joined together and made up the Babu human being and Babu culture. And there is a kind of a logic within the spiritual crisis which a human being today face to. The value confusions, the spiritual vacuum, the selfishness and the cynical attitude, the ignorance of self-contradictions, but only grasp on the immediate interest. And I must say, this spiritual crisis does not only happen in China, in somewhere far away, it's also in the West. It's just under our feet. When the pain of time becoming the pain of timeless. And how could we believe something so-called the evolution? And who is not in exile? This tower never moved. It is only continue build downward. And this synchronic depth is not really only about Chinese. When I met my good friend, the Arab poet Adonis in London, when we read together, and I asked him, what are you going to read tonight? In his sentence, his title was shocking. And he says that it is the concerto of 9/11/2001 BC. Yeah, one little change from AD to BC, 4,000 years have been held inside of poetry. I think we share exactly the understanding. And so if we continually to send out our own questions to the heaven, to me, the Qiyuan spirit will never be out of date. Okay, well, here, this is my concentric circles trilogy, which including concentric circles narrative poems, and these 3 book-long poems crossing 25 years of my life. And recent time was more than 14 years. Poetry really grew up with my human, with me, with men. Especially the last book, this one, the narrative poem. It was written between 2005 and 2010, when I was 50 years old, and my own life joined deeply with the history of China and world. Its topic or themes could be summed up into two sentences. Big history deeply involves the personal life. Therefore, one person's mind became the depth of history. The poem Mother's Handwriting select from this book. Actually, every part of the book has specially designed forms, and the structure of the whole is like layers by layers, deepen and build this whole space inside. Narrative in Chinese could talking about happening happening, but mainly like a man. But poetry, that's a separate word in Chinese. The poems is, to me, suggest a transcendent layers, deepen and bring the personal experience into a universal layer. It's the form I simply call it neo-classicism. I don't know if it's correct or not. But anyway, the aesthetics genes within the Chinese characters run through the whole books, building up something I call the formalism, even the tradition of formalism. And that's what I really hope to continue this long and great glory Chinese poetry tradition, but make this totally contemporary and new version. After all, only one word here I must point out: awareness. The awareness of man and the awareness of language is the point of all what we are talking here. Well, with this in mind, the modern transformation of classical Chinese cultural tradition, it is epic, a very heavy but very great epic. With this historical process, all these difficulties, the tortures, even the backwards, for example, Hong Kong, are not strange. And starting from the impossible, that's my sentence. The more impossible, the stronger energy of starting. We continue. Thank you very much.
For this wonderful talk, and I think it's very rich, and I already see some in the audience are raising their actual physical hands. And if the Zoom audience has any questions, please simply, you can scroll down to your screen and you see reactions, you click it and you can raise your virtual hands. So I will see you, or if you simply type in your chat, I have a question, I will also call you in that order. So I think from the audience here in the room, some of you have raised your hands. Any questions? Yes, Professor Ivo Ameno.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this really very impressive talk. I've got a very simple biographical question. Did you first start reading classical poetry and then start writing your own poetry, or didn't you? And if that was the case, I think you were born 1955, so it was during the Cultural Revolution. How did it come about that you became interested in classical poetry?
Wonderful question. It's a good story also. When I was 6 or 7 years old, because my father loved classical Chinese poetry. So almost every evening after the dinner, and the nightmare sentence coming and says, it's a time to read some poem. Oh my God, I hate poems that time. But anyway, with his not really a push or a force, but I read some classical poems, even Du Fu's simple works like 居零零马萧萧 or this kind of things. And I have no idea about what he talked about, simply no idea. And then Cultural Revolution started. My father been sent to his their countryside. Later I was in my countryside. Only after I started my own writing, and suddenly those seeds of the music from the memory I remember long time ago starting growing in my mind, and then this musical energy, especially the control of the language, is come to judge the sentence I wrote down. I realized I don't allow the sentence which is too easy, too like a prose or essays, like what we say, following this propaganda language. No, the language must have the full energy with the beauty from the classical poetry. And I told my father after, how nice and important he been forced me to read by heart those poems, and he was very, very happy. Yeah. Of course, after I formally started my writings, there was always endlessly the exchange or discussions between my own writing and the great ghosts in the past, like Zhiyi Yang or those. Clearly, I learned later. Yeah.
Talking about musicality, I do have a question I have been kind of yearning to ask, to take the opportunity to ask you in person. So it feels to me that classical Chinese poetry, even though it is an elite genre, but it is also popular. So that means many people, common people, can read and like it. And I have the feeling that musicality is one reason. This kind of musical prosody makes it very easy to read, to memorize, and to recite. And that is also a common critique against modern Chinese poetry, growing out of the free verse tradition. So do you feel that there is a need to rebuild a kind of prosodic form in modern Chinese poetry?
Well, I must say that I give myself a big trouble, which is so far, I read thousands and thousands. You cannot believe how many Chinese poets today, but to pay such attention on form, especially forms based on music, is very, very rare. It's pity for me. Because this is on one side, this is one of the great or maybe greatest style of the Chinese classical Chinese poetry, because whatever qi lü or qi jue, all those most famous classical the forms was simply based on the arrangement of music, and if the classical poets shows their awareness, but not as the individual understanding, but with the development of the history. Yeah, but how and why our contemporary poets failed in this kind of a challenge or this field. So this is why I think back to the word of awareness. I think that always shows that poet and how much, how deep they challenge themselves. And so yeah, I think right now I'm very lonely about this. There are many other sites, very nice, contemporary Chinese poetry, experimental or something, a lot of influence from the outside of China. But this field is all original and actually grow from our own root, but seems mostly been ignored, and people were mainly blind or deaf at this point, which is a great pity. I think, yes, it's necessary. When I was in Bard College in the United States, I teach temporarily for 1 term. And again, I, together with students, studied Du Fu, this poem, from high above. And I asked them, including myself, the translation, to do the translation of this poem. And one of my students handing the paper to me, and I said, what is this? This no meaning at all. And he says, because I'm so fascinated about this music of the classical Chinese poem, of the Du Fu's poem. This is my translation of Du Fu's music, the tunes and the sound. I translated, actually difficult to use the word of translated, but I translated this into a spoken poetry. And I said, read it. And you read it very nicely, very different, creative, crazy, but good. He got the highest point. Yeah, both conceptual and experimental came out from this point, and so I think, yes, this is very, very important.
Thank you. We have a question from the online audience from Professor Frank. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, do you hear me? Okay, so thank you, Yang, for this really stimulating and inspiring lecture. I would like to use a very brief quote by Jacob Edmond from an article from 2013 I actually recently read. And there he writes, Yang explains that where the sea stands still, seeks to escape the repetitions of Chinese collective thought, its collective images and vocabulary, by which he probably means a mainstream-lined language, a simplistic language, maybe propaganda language. And so my question now to you would be, do you think that the classical language, and let's say maybe something like a revival of the classical language in contemporary Chinese poetry, has a function, a particular function, maybe also for you in this context? And if yes, maybe you somehow tell us a little bit about this.
A question?
Brent, would you simplify your question in just 1 or 2 sentences, and maybe even in Chinese?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll better maybe I will make it simpler, and you can translate it into Chinese. So simply, if and how far Yang thinks that the classical language and the use or the use of the classical language in writing contemporary poetry has a certain function to avoid simplicism and propaganda language and mainstream-lined language.
Okay. Even the propaganda language, when I was in China and 1980s, there was experimental on many different directions. Once I actually, a little bit joking, to a novelist, I said, why don't you write a pure propaganda novel, with the extremely that kind of language, but to describe some this kind of a life or situation in that language, not like escaping from that. Well, I never did this, so but I just a little bit joking, but I guess actually there are no the sin of language, and every language could be a source of your mind and the writing, but very much depends on how will you understand and how will you use it. But of course, in our case, just 2 years after Cultural Revolution, and we were deeply rooted because of this language, and because we feel almost there's no way out in this ruin of the language. So in that case, we try to make a crack, to knock the wall and make a crack, just breathing first. It was too difficult, which is not even in the middle of 80s, we have a much more space, or let's try to play something. But that was a desperate situation. There was we can feel that why I wrote the poem in 1989, these 4 walls. The 4 walls is almost in a smaller sailor in the jail. We are in the closed, dark room in the jail, and this 4 face on the 4 walls, which means you have no place to go out. And Tiananmen massacre reminded this again. So that was I think what we did is on one side followed the language from the classical, actually not directly classical poetry, but classical, let's say the words or characters. And in this case, to rather back to the beginning, to the root, and then grow up another tree from there. In order to avoid the kind of a political propaganda language. That was the idea that moment, yeah. But later, of course, if I give you no problem. Yeah, let's say after the middle of 80s, there were much more possibilities which we can think about how to use the language. When as I said that my 3 book-long poems linked together. The first one called Yi, and this one was written between 1985 and 1989, and 4 big parts. The book was based on Book of Change, which on one side very, very deep of the tradition, but at the same time is a contemporary poetry. So almost like one big tree. The root is in the beginning of Chinese tradition, but the leaves and the branches is in the life today. And then the second part, 4 parts with 4 quite big titles. The second part is mainly the history images titled In Symmetry with Death, something like all this, like that. But then the big problem is, how could I find one title to hold all books together? and it was very painful and made me about 3 weeks cannot really eating, sleeping or something. But one day, a lightning coming to invent one character. Yeah, which is if we come back to then I invented one character with the classical way of writing of sun and the classical way of writing of human. Yeah, this one. And classical philosophy in Chinese is called the heaven and the human are one. 天人合一, yeah? But in my contemporary poetry, I also feel the external world and the internal world are one. 内外合一. 一 means one. And then I have to give the pronunciation of this invented character. 一. Yeah, so that was why 一 there. Yeah, in the translation. That means the Chinese character seems very classical, ancient, or something. But I mean, if you look closely, understand deeply, they are also extremely contemporary, even experimental. And so by the way to invent one character with reason, right? Of course, you can invent 1,000 characters within one day, but whether you have a necessary reason, to me, this is a reason, with a reason. But at this way, I feel I hold the very first moment when men meet the language by inventing one character. And so in this case, this book, long poem, that was really big work and find the very root.
That's really beautiful. So that's a Changjie moment for you. Changjie is the mythical creator of
all the librarian people hate me. And they said, oh, you are enjoying your games, but where can we put the book in the library? Yeah, and whatever by Chinese writing or by the English letters, your book, I said, put one book in the one whole section.
Wonderful. We're actually running out of time, but there's one person, one audience among the online audience who has raised their hands already for a long time. So let's take the last question from Professor Dorothea Wippermann, and the presents audience can raise your questions afterwards during Wine and Pretzel. So Professor Wippermann, please unmute yourself.
First, I want to express my gratitude for this wonderful talk, and also my delight to see Yang Lian again. I don't know if he remembers me, but we met in Trier with Professor Pohl in the 90s. So I am very glad to hear your talk today. And my question is a bit similar to the topic and the last question and the topic you just spoke about. Because so from the examples that you presented just in your talk, one can see these poems are not purely classical Chinese. They are still also quite modern Chinese. But still, I also feel some spirit or some similarity to the classical Chinese poetry. But I wanted to ask two questions. One is if you yourself tried to do some purely, some poems in purely classical style, And another question is if you also observe, I mean, there seems to be a contemporary tendency also for that there are some poets who try to do this purely classical Chinese poetry. And if you observe these other examples and how you would evaluate them. Yes, that are my questions.
By the way, where did we meet?
In Trier, in the 1990s, in Tollier, with Professor Pousson.
Okay. I'm sorry, my memory of the people's face are really quite poor. But let's meet again. Yeah. And well, again, I think actually I have this metaphor. What the contemporary Chinese poetry, the most difficult part is we cannot simply copy the classical. And B, we cannot simply copy the Western or international. We are actually something. It's a tower, but built on the both sides of the cliff, like a valley. But even this bridge has no really meeting to the both sides. It's almost hanging in the middle. That is a very strange situation. Even we imagine that we could link with classical and billions of Chinese should understand us, but sorry, it's actually a very lonely situation. Yeah, and in Europe again, like my poems, luckily Brian Houghton is a very nice friend. We've been working together almost 25 years. That's very unique pair of the poet and translator work so closely. And whatever, how experimental or how neoclassical, and he loved poetry. And so in this case, very good. But again, this, let's say not only me, but both of the works I've done in translation also face to something very, very difficult time, because the translation is not the original. A translation could maybe, in a good case, bring certain, let's say, higher percentage, of the poetical original poetics into translation. For example, Brian Houghton and I will now work together, and he sends all his drafts to me. Every sentence, I put my comments, and then discussion, and then he move on to make his final version. In this case, it's a very good examples, but how could I manage for other more than 30 languages? It's impossible. Yeah. So in this case, we are actually like a cow but blind, run into the field and hopefully to meet somebody with a good, understanding. But understanding me, or understanding the translator, or understanding something else, it's a long way to go. But after all, I do not want to give up the responsibility as a poet myself. I must think about Qu Yuan was drowned himself in exile. Du Fu was died in a poor little boat, finally tried to come back to home. The fate of poets forever, everywhere is the same. So let's just take the situation and do our best. And sorry, I don't know whether I answered or not, but
thank you, Yang, for this wonderful image. A tower not only built on a cliff hanging, but also downwards. So that's a very precarious situation. But I think everybody, even if they, some of the audience, like our students, might not be familiar with some of the poems you wrote, they nonetheless have gained a feeling that today you're very self-conscious and well as innovative experimental poet. And I hope that the Zoom audience, you can't see the full body, but I can tell you that Yang Lian is dressed in a combination of classical and avant-garde. He's dressed suit and shirt on top is classical, and the green pants and green shoes down is very avant-garde. So in person, he's embodying this combination, this hybridity of this poetry. So we are very happy to have him here today on the spot, despite the incoming pandemic, the forthcoming pandemic situation. And I'm very grateful for the audience who have joined us today in the room as well as online. And I hope to see you very soon again with our next talk in December by Dr. Marius, sorry, that the name didn't roll off my tongue, and he's going to give a talk on the concept of xiao, of filial piety in Chinese society today. So I hope to see you again very soon. And we thank the poet Yang Lian once again for his great talk.